I'm Chi-Young Harrison Kim from the History Department here. I'll be the moderator today. We have some people to thank at the center before we launch into the program. Their everyday work makes today's event possible. Merklin Lebugwin, Courtney Oshiro Chin, Hanmin Kim, and Claire Park. We are really grateful for their work. We also have to acknowledge the support from South Korea's Academy of Korean Studies. One of the longest protests in the world, if not the longest, is the protest that takes place in Seoul every Wednesday in front of the Japanese embassy. A protest against the harmful and unjust measures of the Japanese government on the issue of sexual slavery during Imperial Japan's involvement in World War II. The Wednesday protest has been happening since 1992. The movement for justice surrounding the comfort women issue is a global effort against a powerful government and its powerful supporting allies. And the movement has made important strides, but frequently this movement is challenged by a forceful entity, as this is the situation as we face at the moment with the publication of Mark Ramseyer's article. This seminar is to address the current problem in the greater context of the global movement for justice for people who suffered in the sexual slavery system. We have invited critical voices from their fields and beyond their fields to discuss this heavy topic. Let me introduce our speakers today. First, we have Alexis Dudden. She is professor of history at the University of Connecticut, and she has done research and also taught classes on Japan-Korea relations, history of empire. She's also the author of Japan's colonization of Korea, Discourse and Power. We also have Tae-Young Baek, the director of the Center for Korean Studies, as well as professor of law at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. His main research is international human rights, and he also works for the UN Council Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearance. Our next speaker is David Saw. He's an attorney with Yoshida and Saw, and he is also the vice president of the United Korean Association of Hawaii. And finally, we have Na-Young Lee, professor of sociology at Chung-Ang University. She has written widely on the topic of empire and also society and gender, especially on the issue of sexual slavery. And currently, she's the chair of the Korean Council for the Justice for Comfort Women, better known in Korean as Jeongi Kiok Yeondae, Jeongi-yeon. We welcome all of you, and we thank you for your time today. We will have a chance for discussion afterwards. So audience members, please send us your questions either through the Q&A box or the chat box. And I would also like to remind everyone that this will be recorded and later posted on our YouTube site. And I believe right now this is live on our Facebook page. So let's get started. Our first speaker is Professor Alexis Dudden from the University of Connecticut.
Thank you so much, Harrison. Thank you, Professor Beck. And I really appreciate being included in this conversation. We have a lot to talk about. Let me get straight to my slides. And let's see, could I possibly be included in screen sharing? If not, just need to. Can I do it now? Not quite yet.
You can. Go ahead, please.
I'm not sure. We just did try. It's okay. I can talk without slides if I need to.
The screen sharing is allowed, so will you try one more time by clicking share screen button?
Yeah, I'm trying that.
Yeah, now it's on.
There we go. Yes.
You picked up some wrong screen.
Let's see. I really apologize. I can't see it, but that's okay.
No, it is chosen not your proper program, so you should go back and choose another slide by unsharing first.
Yes.
Now it's on.
Very good.
Okay. I do apologize. I have been now Zooming for a year, and I still can't do it. Okay. I do apologize for that. I have a very clear point tonight because I think all of us agree. We know the basic history, the basic contours of state-sponsored militarized sexual slavery under the Japanese imperial wartime era is actually not a matter for debate. We know that the victims, women, girls, boys, were coerced, trafficked into conditions against their will. And what I'd like to emphasize tonight is the importance of the term state, because it's something we know that the terminology is cumbersome. We know the victims themselves at times would prefer different terms for what we use. But the word that I think is most important for everybody to understand is state in state-sponsored crime. And I want to begin with the very well-known map. This is generated about over a decade ago now. But when we look at the sheer volume of places, comfort stations, also a horrendous euphemism for what might be more properly termed rape camps or rape stations. This is only possible by state apparatus and the workings of a government. We do understand that there were private entities involved in this. And so when the denialists, especially Ramseyer supporters, including Ramseyer's article itself, emphasize, well, private individuals contracted, these were private brokers, they were organized by the state apparatus. And the sheer volume of this map demonstrates this in a way that's comparable to acts of other crimes against humanity and war crimes that we see across the 20th and into the 21st century. So I think it's important to begin with just the magnitude of what we're talking about. There is no way this could have taken place without the backing of a state. And so the state reparations and state atonement that victims, beginning with the Halmani, but throughout the areas of Japan's former empire seek, continue to be the goal. And in this would be in the form of a Japanese cabinet level decision, a Diet resolution involving the sitting prime minister, it's currently Prime Minister Suga, in front of the global media explaining the terms, not something done in secret behind closed doors. This also would therefore be a parliamentary decided atonement package, however to be determined. And I say that because we have these, the constant, Japan has already apologized. Japan has already paid money. There have been, as we know, we keep saying, are we still fighting this again and again? We have had the quasi-governmental organizations. We have had the private apologies. Those do matter because it conveys remorse, but not when we're talking about a crime against humanity. Agreements without victim involvement, as we know, based on the so-called 2015 accord, also don't work. And I think it's really important, especially as Prime Minister Suga is on the verge of visiting President Biden in Washington, please let's all bear in mind that the so-called 2015 Accord is not a piece of paper, right? It's a handshake, it's private conversations. There are no signatures. And so we need to understand that we still don't have what we're seeking, which again, state atonement, state acknowledgement of the crime. And the main reason for this now, I believe, is that this history has been so reduced to Korea versus Japan that we are still unable to break out and convey the magnitude of the crime. That's why I began with that slide that shows all of the camps, because when this is reduced to a Japan versus Korea, particularly a South Korea issue, not only are the other victims effaced, but their representatives don't understand why the people whom they represent are less important in this history. In my thinking, in 2015, when the December 2015 Accord was announced, even before South Korean survivors, were able to protest the terms of it, the Taiwanese representative said, well, where's ours? And so we need to continue to remember this is not a Japan-Korea issue. This is an empire-wide issue, and that again is why the state acknowledgement of the magnitude of this history is essential. I'm just quickly throwing up the 1993 Kono statement, and I'm sure Professor Lee would agree that, 1993, when this came out, we thought, well, we need more, we want more. And now I feel so old, but bring us back to Kono, right? I mean, if only we were still there. Because if anybody who can just read this slide quickly, the government of Japan begins to take responsibility in this statement. The government of Japan will listen to views, how we can express, we shall face squarely the historical facts. And this final section of the Kono statement is precisely what has been effaced since 2012, which is the teaching this as a lesson of history. The continuous education of this history is essential. And so when the government of Japan, since 2014, especially says that it upholds the Kono statement, it's not telling the truth, because it is no longer teaching as promised the history that happened under Japanese rule. And this is where education and required learning come in, because we all know that, well, at least those of us who are teachers, especially now at the end of a semester, we know that students don't always do their homework. And so it isn't really, it's not so much the textbook per se that matters, but looking at a textbook as what the state demands as required education. And only 10 days ago, the latest round of textbooks, secondary school textbooks from Japan is released. And again, not only is the number of references to the history of militarized, state-sponsored militarized sexual slavery reduced, but now we have the efforts of Mark Ramseyer's egregious article, which is to even change the name further to try to call all of its victims prostitutes. So we understand the significance of conveying the state responsibility and the agreed international terms through education. Just two more slides, because it really is important to me personally to expand this from a Korea versus Japan issue, because there are so many voices in Japan that get effaced, erased by their own government's efforts to deny this history. This is taken at the Wednesday demonstration that Professor Kim was mentioning in May 2017. And these are three women from Saitama who traveled to Seoul on their own savings, their own money. They had studied Korean language together through NHK television programs so that they could create a sign to stand and share their feelings as fellow human beings. This is just a matter to overcome together and not in opposition. And this is also, most importantly, too, what survivors themselves from Korea in particular have done in the last 20 years, but especially in the last 10 years, which is to expand the history of the horror they endured and take it around the world to ongoing instances of state-sponsored terror against girls and boys during wartime. So again, thank you. Just wanted to emphasize the key point is to really hone in on the importance of holding state responsible. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that illuminating talk with the strong message of the global aspect of this issue and the movement, and also the important role of education here. Thank you, Professor Dudden. Our next speaker is Tae-Young Baek, the director of our center and a human rights lawyer. Tae-Young, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank all of the participants as a panelist today, and also the attendees. We have quite a good big number of attendees today, and I'm very glad to be part of this important project as a director of the Center for Korean Studies. And I think all of us know what important kind of meaning today's discussion this discussion we'll have. And additionally, I would like to point out one thing before starting a talk about the issue itself, because this is our second Korea Vision dialogue. We, the Center for Korean Studies, are trying to focus on issues that are very important for the future of Korea, and also broadly the future of the region as well. And this issue, comfort women issue, is I believe one of the key issues that also is necessary for us to think about the future of the region. Mark Ramseyer's article actually detonated a huge dispute on the comfort women case, one of the highly sensitive historical issues in the relationship between Korea and Japan. However, this is not a new situation, I should say. The tension and the conflict had been appearing in various ways since the issue had been known in early 1990s, and especially in the after 2011 Korean Constitutional Court decision that the omission of South Korean government to resolve the sufferings of so-called Japanese military comfort women by seeking a dispute settlement with Japan was against the constitution. It urged the government to take diplomatic steps to provide remedies for the harm done to the comfort women victims, which was a huge victory for the victims of the comfort women. However, it was also viewed as a very, very serious concern by Japanese government because it revives the dispute on historical injustice issue. On December 29th in 2015, as Professor Dudden mentioned, the government of Park Geun-hye and the Japan government, Shinzo Abe, abruptly actually announced that they had reached an agreement to resolve the comfort women issue irreversibly. But it incorporates some of the apology and the establishment of foundation with some compensation package included, but in reality, they failed to get the consent from the victims. And because of that, they could not prevent the victims' continuous demand for justice. And that's why the court proceeding continued, and the court decision recently came out in January 2021. In the meantime, Korean Supreme Court also concluded this court case in 2012 with regard to forced labor issues. As you know, during the Pacific War, a lot of South Korean national, of course, not only South Korean but North Korean and other occupied territory civilians were drafted to work in warfield or some factories. And the South Korean Constitutional Supreme Court at the time found that those companies who were benefited by those crimes against humanity or other human rights violations should be responsible. So the South Korean Supreme Court awarded 100 million Korean won, which is approximately $88,000 per person for 4 victims of the forced conscription of the Nippon Steel and Sumitomo Metal Corporation. Of course, Japan government, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe denounced the decision, saying that it was unacceptable under the international law. And Japan considered it was completely and finally settled by the 1965 Treaty on Basic Relations between Korea and Japan. And also, therefore, Japan was denying any kind of measure, even if it is taken by corporation, not by the government. After the court decision, as we all know, a huge debate, stony remarks among the government, and also a boycott campaign by civil society, and also the export restriction by Japan government as a response. South Korea is a very, very strong rebuttal with other measures. So a lot of debate we have seen arising with regard to comfort women issue as well as a forced labor issue. And one big additional kind of issue developed was the decision of Supreme Court, Seoul Central District Courts on January 8th, 2021, this year. And that decision decided that Japanese government should pay $91,800 each to 12 Korean women forced into sexual slavery. So comfort women victims get again victory in South Korean court. However, this time it is a decision that Japan government should be responsible for those wartime atrocities. Japan government responded as Korean court had no jurisdiction of Japan and decided not to take any additional action, including appeal in the court. So all this development, we are seeing that this issue is not simple compensation for comfort women issue. Rather, it is an all interrelated issue. Japan's comfort women case, forced labor case, and also other matters, even including doctor issues, because all these are related to historical legacy of Japanese colonialism that started in 1910 until 1945, and also the San Francisco Peace Treaty that coined the regional world order after the war, and also 1965 Basic Treaty also is a key treaty that are involved here. So it is obvious that it will not be very easy to handle this case with one kind of a simple solution. And so I don't think I can come up with a complete, solution or some suggestion that resolve all of the matter at once here. But to me, one of the most important kind of a standard that we need to stick to is the standard that we focus on. And the bottom line of dealing with the comfort women case should be clear standard how to respond to the past human rights violations and crimes against humanity, which will be really the better to build a lasting bridge for the future to guarantee peace and mutual prosperity. So it has two dimensions. On the one hand, how to handle properly those human rights violations, and how can we make this as a process to bridge better cooperation, co-prosperity, guaranteeing regional, new world regional kind of system in Asia. One of the most important principles of international law today is that the victims of the crimes against humanity or war crimes hold the rights to demand the truth-seeking, restitution, and proper reparation and non-recurrence of the violation, while the perpetrators of violations owe international domestic obligations to provide effective remedies to the victims for the suffering. And the UN has been keen to develop a standard, and in 2006, we have seen UN General Assembly adopting the basic principle and guidelines on the right to remedy and reparation for victims of gross violation of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law. So, although Japan government views that under current international law principle, the 1965 agreements or other agreements between the government can completely solve historical issues of human rights violation, the world human rights standard is not like that. And under current international law regime, certain rights have been considered so important that they are non-derogable and considered as jus cogens norm. And they cannot be simply disregarded by one government's will or domestic law. And the primary spirit of a Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaty also acknowledges with its own Article 53, which is considered as a basis of international law. It says a treaty is void if at the time of its conclusion, if it conflicts with a peremptory norm of general international law. So if any government try to claim that those fundamental human injustice can be justified through some governmental measure or treaties, it's against international law. That's a really important aspect that we should consider when we discuss this issue. So I have been involved with a couple of publication projects, one of which is related to the legal ground that had been used for South Korean Seoul Central District Court decision on comfort of women. And I am also working on the forced labor issue as well. But I will not go in detail about that. The only thing that I want to make clear is that it is right for South Korean court to properly consider the fundamental human rights of those serious violation of human rights victims should be considered, and their suffering should be remedied in one way or another. And South Korean government and South Korean court has been very diligent in giving remedies to those human rights victims, since even the start of the current South Korean government, Korean regime, including Korean war victims, democracy movement-related victims, and others. So all of those human rights victims cases should be considered seriously. In the same vein, those Japanese, military-related victims should be properly given remedies. And in the same vein, Japan government also should consider those matters in the same spirit. Unfortunately, however, I should point out that Japan's government's emphasis, the response to this problem was not actually very, very promising and meeting the standard. I'm sorry to talk about this real example in UN, but as you may know, Japan is a member of UN Committee on Enforced Disappearances, and in its review on November 19th in 2018, they had this committee had reviewed Japan's situation, and in its concluding observation, the committee stated that it regrets the state party's position that the issue is resolved finally and irreversibly saying that this perpetuates impunity and denies victims their right to know the truth and to obtain justice, reparation, and guarantee of non-repetition. Committee pointed out that Japanese government position that the issue has been finally and irreversibly resolved permanently blocks the prosecution of the perpetrator and denies the victim's right to justice and compensation, and to receive a guarantee that such acts will not be reoccur. However, and the committee actually gave a detailed explanations like lack of reparation for conflict women, lack of efforts to comprehend the truth of those disappearances that had happened with regard to conflict women, and lack of statistics and other stuff. However, Japanese government responded by vehemently denying the committee's decision and assessment, which caused a considerable friction between UN bodies and the government. So I don't think that Japan is really dealing with this country as a human rights protecting state, a human rights loving country that is not really meeting the current highly developed international human rights standard. And I personally think that Japan should change its attitude so that it can give proper remedies to those historical victims, while by doing that, Japan can lead the countries and the movement for human rights. Finally, I would like to mention one thing with regard to recently raised concerns. So in South Korea, there are some voices that the conflict women case could be brought to the International Court of Justice. But personally, I think it could be somewhat dangerous and not very persuasive, I feel, because first of all, South Korean government now it bring the case against the Japan government, because ICJ only allows the government to bring the case. And that kind of a case does not make much sense after such a long history and friction that had gone on. And furthermore, ICJ's decision actually, I don't think, can end all of the disputes and concerns and the victims' demands and effect requests. So therefore, this could be, kind of a process of rather resolving the issue, rather aggravate the issue. So more important thing, I think, is to enhance the human rights standard, correcting the historical wrongs, and working continuously with the victims, and continuously, negotiate the possible way to resolve the issues and the concerns of the victims as much as possible. So again, my approach, I think important is the human-centered and victim-oriented approach, and Japan can take it, because Japan don't have much to lose by taking it, because it gives more opportunity to Japan to be a leader, as I said, in the region. And we expect that kind of matures approach to this issue from Japan. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Taeyong, for that insight into the intricate landscape of the global legal situation here, and your serious call on the Japanese government to take a more of a leading role in this issue. Okay, thank you. Our third speaker is Professor Na-Young Lee of Chung-Ang University. And I gotta say, we are just so fortunate to have Professor Lee here. She's not just a scholar, but she's also at the forefront of this extremely difficult movement as a leader of the most important organization on the issue of sexual slavery. So we are so fortunate and honored to have you here, Professor Lee. Please.
You are muted.
Thank you so much for your introduction, Harrison Kim, and thank you so much for inviting me to this very important event, and Dr. Beck. So I feel very honored to be here. So I'd like to share my presentation first of all, and then I want to share my idea then. Okay, today's my talk is about global network of Japanese historical revisionism or denialism. Actually, as you might know, Harvard Law School professor Mark Lemjer's article in the Pacific Wars to the heated controversy. Scholars in South Korea, Japan, and United States authored numerous statements and organized academic events challenging his denial of historical truth and unethical misuse of historical documents. For example, Tessa Morris Suzuki, Ustina Dogopo, Alexis Dudden here, Amy Stanley, Young Sik Lee, Fight for Justice, the Korean Council, so many people I cannot share here. Criticism poured in from students and advocates around the world who issued a statement. And sometimes they make a protest. And even Japanese military comfort women, victim survivors themselves, responded orally or via written statement. For example, Lee Yong-soo and Lee Ok-sun. On the other hand, statements and editorials that support Professor Ramseyer were intermittently issued. And Ramseyer even sent thank you emails to some of his supporters. For example, Nishioka Tsutomu, Izaki Michio, Katsuoka Kanji, Jace Morgan, Nishimada Yuichi, and Takamashi Shiro, and etc. On February 8, 2021, a statement in support of Ramseyer titled Open Letter in Support of Professor John Mark Ramseyer was sent to the editorial board of International Review of Law and Economics. Dear IRA editors, we understand are historians of modern Japan and East Asia. We write in support of our colleague, the renowned Harvard Law School Professor John Mark Ramseyer. His essay in the March 2021 issue of your journal is the latest target of American cancel culture. As with all of his other work on modern Japan's history, law, and political economy, however, Ramseyer's Contracting for Sex in the Pacific War is an eminently scholarly effort rooted in a remarkable breadth of source material, a great achievement deserving of praise, not censure. This statement written by Izaki Michio, Vice President, Historical Awareness Research Council, Katsuoka Kanji, Lecturer, Meiji University, Jason Morgan, Associate Professor in Reitaku University, Nishioka Tsutomu, Professor in Reitaku University, and President of Historical Awareness Research Council, Shimita Yuichi and Takashi Shiro. Actually, I found another important letter from very similar people to block attempt to install a statue of peace in Berlin, in Germany. 2019, Yano Yoshiaki sent an email to one professor of Japanese studies in Leipzig University with a letter written by Fujioka Nobukatsu and other people. Fujioka Nobukatsu is from University of Tokyo, founded a liberal view of historical study group in 1995. Yamashita Eiichi, International Research Institute of Controversial Histories. Actually, he founded that kind of institute in 2019. Japanese Society for Historical Textbook Reform, which was very notorious to revise the historical textbook. In that institute, Nishio Kanji and Fujioka Nobukatsu and the Takaji Shiro were included. So I think, what is that? The Global Alliance for Historical Truth is established in 2014. In that institute, Fujioka Nobukatsu and Yamamoto Yomiko were leaders at the time. And also, Yamamoto Yumiko is a leader of Nadeshiko Action. In English, Japanese Women for Justice and Peace. And they are now creating a Germany category to stop the building the Statue of Peace. Since 2013, in many events in the United States, I found a very similar person's name. So I have a question. Who are they? And how are they interconnected? What are the organizations? Why have they turned into the United States? So as tracking the organizational route, I explored the formation, growth, and the connection of the Japanese global network of historical denialism for this presentation, instead of focusing on Ramseyer's article. I particularly pay attention to 4 pieces, 1997, 2007, 2013, and 2015 as key turning points, through which I think the United States become major battleground of Japan's history wars. This process is neither one-sided nor one-dimensional, although it progressed in contradictory, collusive, and dialectical ways at times. As a strong transnational public-private network has been formed over time. So the year 1997 marked the turning point in which Japan started systematically organizing its conservative shift and turns its eyes toward international society. First, key ultra-right organizations were formed. Japanese Society for History Textbook Reform, 새로운 역사 교과서 만드는 모임, 세영모, started its activities, and Japan Conference, 일본 회의, 니폰 가이키, was formed through the merger of a national conference to protect Japan and Society for the Protection of Japan. Second, Chinese-American author Iris Zhang's The Rape of Nanking, The Forgotten Holocaust of World War II, became a best-selling 1997, 60 years after the Nanjing Massacre, which raised the global awareness of the autocracies committed by the Japanese military during World War II. Third, expansion of international public awareness on the Japanese military sexual slavery issue. For example, a series of UN reports, including Gay McDougall's report, and 2000 Women's International War Crime Tribunal. So this is a Ilbon Pei website. And this is the book of Rape of Nanking Massacre. And third one is Gay McDougall's report. And after Abe Shinzo came to power in 2006, 2007 marked a decisive moment, another decisive moment, when far-right history revisionist activists expanded toward more international community, including the United States. The first founding organization is JETUKWE, the Association of Citizens Against the Special Privileges of Zainichi. As you might know, in many articles of Ramseyer deal with the Zainichi issue from a very racist perspective. Japan Family Value Society, also formed in 2007. Japan's right-wing intellectuals published an opinion advertisement, The Fact, in the Washington Post, also in 2007. Japan's American Mera Goichi founded the study group for Japan's rebirth for Japanese Americans in Korean Inborn 재생연구회 in Los Angeles in 2006. Actually, from 2007, Mera Goichi started a very active activism. Interestingly, Mera Goichi was born in 1993 in Seoul, South Korea, and during colonization period, and immigrated to the United States after Japan's defeated in World War II. So he is called as Shinisei. Another decisive point in 2007, I think the U.S. House of Representatives Resolution 121 is triggered the Japan's right wing's systematization and expansion. First one, the Congress of various countries adopted similar resolutions, urging Japan to apologize to the Japanese military comfort women. For example, Dutch Parliament, Canadian Parliament, European Parliament, Union Parliament. Second, memorials for Japanese military comfort women started being installed not only in Korea, but also around the world. Since then, many right-wing organizations make new forms and newly constructed with various people. In 2008, Society for Dissemination of Historical Fact was formed, led by Case Hideaki. In 2011, Texas Oyaji, in English, Texas Daddy, and Tony Marano appeared. And in 2011, Nadesco Action was founded by Yamamoto Yumiko. Actually, Yamamoto Yumiko was a former vice president of the Association of Citizens Against the Special Privileges of Zainichi, so ZK, 부회장. Another important phase was 2013, when Statue of Peace was established in Glendale, as you might know, California and US. So People's Campaign for the Truth about Comfort Women was formed to systematically respond to that kind of movement. And in February 2014, the Global Alliance for Historical Truth also formed by Mera Goichi, Fujioka Nobukazu, Yamamoto Yumiko. And the last one is, I think, 2015. The 2015 movement to establish the Comfort Woman Memorial in San Francisco became another historical phase. So, in a resolution, the resolution of establish the Comfort Woman Memorial was presented at the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. So lots of right-wing groups inside Japan, outside Japan, get together to fight against that kind of resolution and to stop the building the statue in San Francisco. So I think strong kinship among activists, scholars, and the politicians across the Pacific has finally completed. So I just skipped this kind of timeline, and I try to conclude. The global network of Japanese historical denialism has not self-developed through inner motivation, but has been dynamically constructed and systematically organized against the movement for historical justice since the 1990s. Considering each phase of expansion and the strengthening of network, the Ramseyer incident should be understood with a larger lens. debate surrounding academic integrity versus academic freedom, or historical fallacy versus historical truth regarding Ramsey's article also should be situated in the broader historical context. So why Ramsey needed now? For what? This is my last question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that insightful presentation on the global network of denialism. It is really highly intricate and yet convoluted global landscape. All right, let's move on. Our final speaker is Counselor David Saw, who is Vice President of the United Korean Association of Hawaii. One small but important voice in this whole movement is the voice of the diaspora. And here in Hawaii, we are a place where Koreans, Japanese have lived together next to each other as brothers and sisters for a very long time. And at the same time, this issue is still very much of a living issue for us as well. So we turn to Counselor David Saw to give us a voice from the local community. I think you're muted, Counselor. Yes.
Thank you so much for that introduction, because it sets the tone of what I'd like to share with you today. But before that, I'm very humbled and honored to be invited to share a few comments about this article from the local Korean American community's perspective. And please note that this is just one of the many views and points that many other people could have. But briefly about Koreans in Hawaii. As you may know, Hawaii has a long history of Korean immigration, which began in 1903. And Hawaii was, and perhaps still is, the gateway for migrants from Korea moving on to the mainland USA. So we have Koreans who are third, fourth generations from the first wave immigrants, as well as the first generations and middle generations, such as myself, from the second wave of immigration that began in 1970s. In Hawaii, Asians dominate the population with about 38%, identifying themselves as Asian alone, and 10% of Pacific Islanders compares to about 25% of white. And we have the largest percentage of multiracial individuals who take up about 24% of the population. Among the Asians, Filipino and Japanese are the largest groups at about 15% and 13% respectively, followed by Chinese and then Koreans at 1.7%. So the Koreans are the minority among the dominating Asians in Hawaii's economy and politics. But all those people with different ethnic background, we are not separated by borders or oceans or nationalistic ideologies. We are everyday neighbors, co-workers, friends, and family members, as Professor Kim mentioned. So as an example, our Korean Association organized a mass vaccination clinic for Korean seniors who are having difficult time making individual appointments for COVID vaccines, obviously due to their language and technical barriers. Just yesterday, we were able to serve 400 people with the help from our local pharmacy group. I happened to notice one person who came to receive the COVID vaccine, and she was accompanied by a Korean lady. I realized that the person was Japanese when I overheard that person and one of the pharmacists conversing in Japanese. And true to the ethnic composition of Hawaii, the pharmacists who were assisting Korean seniors were African American, Japanese, Filipino, and Chinese, and who also enjoyed the lunch provided by a local Korean barbecue restaurant. So we respect each ethnic group's history and culture, and we all learn from each other. This only enhances and enriches our lives and experiences. We are very fortunate to live in Hawaii, where most people honor different cultures and have no problems interacting with people of different color and or ethnicity. The problem we have with the Ramseyer article as members of the Korean American community is that it could alienate the two groups, Koreans and Japanese, and it causes a resentment against Japanese. And he's doing that by an inaccurate and misleading account of history. When we heard about his article, I think we were at first slightly bewildered. I mean, look at his credentials. He's a law professor at the top university. Koreans learn to respect the professors, and I mean, anybody from Harvard should be respected. I mean, he must have done such a wonderful research, have evidence to support his claim, and he couldn't be just making up a story. And then we became very upset and angry as we learned more about his claim. So we organized the petition drive to denounce and demand the retraction of his article. And ironically, we also felt proud at the same time of the fact that there are many Korean scholars and researchers who can easily refute Professor Ramseyer's distortion of history. And particularly his fellow law professor, Professor Jeannie Gerson, and you, Professors Dudden, Lee, and Kim, and Beck, are doing excellent job in countering his article. We and most Korean Americans share the goal with any other ethnic groups to build a strong foundation for success and prosperity for our next generation and for the state of Hawaii and America as a whole. And doing so requires a fight against ethnic bias and bigotry that are further dividing America. As you can see with respect to the most recent Asian hatred, I can't help but to kind of make the connection as to what is going on in the American communities and cities at this time. Again, we are very concerned about Professor Ramseyer's article working to alienate and further dividing the community rather than bringing mutual respect, understanding, and reconciliation among the community groups. In a way, his article woke us up and made us realize that there are still those who want to distort history for political gains. But we who are living in Hawaii have more practical goal, more down-to-earth goal of being good neighbors with each other and building one big ohana with everyone. So this is what we are planning to do as an organization to do in August in light of the Ramseyer article and recent anti-Asian violence. Typically, as you may know, August is when we hold Koreans-only ceremony to commemorate the Liberation Day. But this time, we want to reach out to the other community members and groups, including Japanese, Chinese, Taiwanese, and Filipino, whose history is interwoven with violence and pain brought by World War II. We want to work together to resist the historical revisionism through seminars and dialogues like this, and through education, and fight against anti-Asian bias and racism by coming together amongst ourselves first. We hope that our efforts to bring different ethnic groups together in reconciliation efforts will be an example for the rest of the country. And thank you for this opportunity to speak on behalf of the Korean American community in Hawaii. Professor Kim.
Thank you very much, Councillor Saw. I think your voice is a very fair representation of our community here and our continuous effort to live together in harmony. Thank you very much for that. I think we should move into the discussion portion of the event. We are getting some really good questions, and I will briefly summarize the questions and for you guys. Maybe the first question can be sent to Professor Dudden and Professor Lee. So this person is asking how this movement is connected to the politics, identity politics, for example, and especially in the context of the Me Too movement. So this person is is kind of concerned that the comfort women issue is becoming an issue of gender identity as part of this another very movement, a very important movement, the Me Too movement. So, what is your sense about this kind of movement becoming a identity politics issue? Professor Lee or Professor Dudden, you guys can.
Professor Lee, would you like to?
Yeah, could you unmute, Professor Lee?
Yeah, please go ahead, Dudden.
So, I mean, part of the problem is the terminology, right? Comfort women is an incorrect, horrific euphemism. We're talking about child sex trafficking, and we know there to have been victims who were male. And so even the terminology is wrong. Is it a gender issue? Of course it's a gender issue. It also equally is the targeted violence against girls and women during war that is an ongoing feature of war. And so the denialists who say, oh, well, rape always accompanies war, prostitutes follow soldiers, that is totally wrong-headed approach to this issue that is a UN-defined crime against humanity. And we're talking again about the trafficking of children for sex for soldiers during wartime. So from the beginning, it's gendered in the preponderance of victims, but that is not new to the Me Too movement. This has been for example, very specifically, one of the reasons it was so difficult for survivors to come forward with their stories everywhere in the empire was the patriarchal societies to which they returned. There was no space for a survivor to come forward and say, I was raped 40 times a day, and expect to integrate into society. That particularly South Korean and Filipina and Japanese feminist movements in the 70s and 80s, 1970s and 80s, enabled the space in those societies to encourage and bring survivors' voices forward. That's a positive act of gender history. Fast forward to 2005, when there was progress in this movement. That was a movement forward for gender bias and gender dislocation. But I guess I just want to thank Councillor Suh so much for your remarks about not just the amazing place that is Hawaii, but what Professor Ramseyer's article attempted to do, which is to alienate by race. And so this is to circle back to the question. I see the Ramseyer incident more as anti-Asian, anti-Asian American, as well as anti-women. I mean, he's clearly targeting a number of female scholars, as are his supporters, in very derogatory anti-female terms. But what he's really doing is race baiting. And that's key in the sense that this article about contracting for sex, as well as other articles that he's published about the 1923 earthquake, simply target Koreans. And just categorically, everything is Koreans' fault. And this is not only ahistorical and wrong-headed, but as Councillor Suh has so eloquently just explained, that for decades now, since the end of the Japanese Empire, everybody who has had to inhabit the planet that wants to move forward has tried to move forward. The denialists, as the Trumpists in the United States do, retreat into their racial privileged categories of whiteness in particular. And that's what this article is attempting to achieve, which is some putative notion of Japanese pride at the expense of some fabricated notion of being Korean. And in so doing is, as you have really brilliantly underscored, an attempt to alienate communities that have worked trying to come together against a history of horror. Sorry to go on, but I think that this moment is better seen in the context of anti-Asian action taking place around the world. Thanks. Sorry to go on.
Thank you, Professor Dudden. Professor Lee, would you like to comment?
Yeah. Thank you so much for your comment, Alexis Dudden. Yeah, I totally agree with your opinion and point of view. I just add one point. I think to understand the issue of comfort women as a simple perspective, from one perspective, is very dangerous. So we cannot understand the issue from one point, because the issue itself is very complex and intersectional, complicated with gender, race, nation, class, and other things. So also the situation happened under the Imperial Japanese colonization and wartime period. So and very extremely patriarchal society. So it cannot be approached by one point, one single lens, I think. So that is my answer.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Lee. Our next question can be addressed to Professor Beck. You mentioned that the ICJ, the decisions of the ICJ, or bringing the case to ICJ would be very difficult. But at the same time, you also said that Japan also rejected South Korea's court decisions as well. So in your opinion, what do you think is one solution in this kind of dilemma, in this kind of highly limited legal landscape?
I should answer that there is no one solution to this problem, I think. And I would like to mention that sometimes legal solution might not be the only solution. So, of course, I know who are bringing lawsuits against either Japan government or even South Korean government on behalf of those victims. And they are really admirable, great lawyers and my friends as well. However, I would also point out that lawsuit is one of the avenue for the victims who are pursuing some form of justice or remedies. And in the same vein, International Court of Justice, which is currently the dispute settlement mechanism among UN members, is also one of the avenue. And as you know, the current ICJ has jurisdiction only when member states agree to bring the case to that forum. And if South Korea at this stage does not agree, it will not be actually brought to the court. So it is a kind of a choice of some measure to address this issue. Unfortunately, as I discussed in my presentation, I fear that we are not at that stage to resolve this issue through one legal litigation and winning and losing in the court proceeding. To do that, there should be some precondition. When we file a lawsuit, for example, we are this kind of agreeing to abide by the decision, and they should be the end of the dispute. But at this stage, those historical issues that we are currently facing are not really something that people can take in that way. And no matter what governments are doing, still, unless the victims and those civil society organization reaches some level of understanding, the issue will not go away. So my recommendation is to, emphasize the standard of human rights and in both countries, and also the efforts should continue in terms of promoting dialogue between the two societies and also the victims and the government. And it will take some time. Then when can we seek permanent resolution of this issue? Probably, I think, when Asia can also establish a regional human rights court, for example, or some type of a human rights chart that all of states can agree upon. At this time, victims, not only those conflict victims, but also other human rights victims in Asia, do not trust the governments so much when it comes to governmental response to human rights issues. So we should build trust, and we should find some heightened human rights standard where victims of human rights violations will be treated properly. In that sense, South Korea is not also free from criticism. Like South Korea had joined the Vietnamese War, for example, and a lot of other human rights violations had been committed by South Korean government in the past. Those should be continuously raised. And in the same way, the governments, not only South Korea, but also Japan and other governments, should work hard to at least meet the standard to give remedies to those victims. So we need a lot of things to do. So sometimes this problem is not really a problem. It is an opportunity, I think. It is not only an issue of confrontation, but also some medium for the government to work together. So to have this dispute, I am kind of, in some sense, optimistic that the two governments will deal with this issue, eventually enhance the cooperation and existence in peace, and also bringing co-prosperity in Asia. So we should have some kind of optimism, eventually making the bad things turn into good things. That would be my response.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Peck. I have a question for Councillor Suh. Do you think it's possible for Hawaii's Korean community to consider erecting a peace statue here, just as other cities in the country have done? You think it's feasible here?
I think it is feasible. It's a different situation, different soil, different environment than the city of Glendale or another city in New Jersey, definitely, because we do have a lot more parties who may be interested in seeing this. If we can convince them the true purpose of erecting the Statue of Freedom. It's not about just compensation for the victims, but it's about humanity. It's about the universal ideas of peace that we all have to strive to preserve. And we have to all fight together against the force that is making these things happen, as reflected in the Ramseyer article. So we do have a little bit more challenging situation to convince other ethnic groups, but I think that can be done. But we have to have a more global approach to this idea or the goal of bringing more peace and the understanding in Hawaii.
Thank you. Our next question can be for both Professor Dudden and Professor Lee as well. So this question is very relevant to, so while the country of Germany has made real strides, not only in its apology, but its public atonement, a system of memorialization, a system of education about its crimes in the past. Why is the situation so different for Japan? When in popular history, we see these two entities sometimes from a similar light. But why is there such a big difference in how they have responded to the public address of their crimes?
Historian.
Lee?
And also, I think I'd like to hear Harrison Kim's idea about that.
Oh,
As a historian.
yes. I do have some thoughts about that, but Professor Dudden, please.
You should have.
Yeah.
Okay.
Who's going to?
Moderator has the right to speak, I think.
Yes. Oh, Professor Dudden, please.
Okay. Well, very clearly, in 1995, for example, when similar questions were, why can't Japan be more like Germany? There was some way of understanding that there was just this heavy weight of voices that was landing on Japan almost for the first time. And so Japanese society was dealing with new information in a way that Germany had been mediating for decades. Fast forward now, 25 years later, and now it's bewildering that Japan has taken itself out of the international community. And this goes back to what both Professor Lee and Professor Beck, but also what, Professor Counselor Sa is saying too. People have been trying to work together. So what is this particular organization in Japan that is, or this group of political this particular political voice in Japan that is moving in a totally different direction? But then you say, well, is this a totally different direction, or does this agree with populist movements around the world? Look at the Italian Northern League, look at the Trump supporters, look at the revanchists who would wave Confederate flags in the United States. And there are a lot of similarities of impulse. And, is this purely economics? I don't think it's purely economics, and that's where I would sort of circle back to what is Japan doing, or what are the denialists in Japan asking to do that other countries are not? What I find fascinating in the debate over statues and tearing down statues around the world, only Japan is asking to tear down a statue of a victim. Right? There are debates about Cecil Rhodes. There are debates about Woodrow Wilson. But only Japan is seeking to tear down statues of victims. And that gets into a deep, deep memory war over the terms of the catastrophic loss in 1945. So sorry to circle back, but that's what historians do. Harrison, it's all you.
Oh my. I think, yes, thank you for that, Professor Dutton. I think there are some big historical elements that are highly important here. The first is the fact that Japan, in a way, has chosen to maintain its political system. It is still pretty much the same political system centered on the imperial prestige, and which is heavily based on a singular national identity. So I think this factor is there, whereas Germany didn't want anything to do with the Nazi system of mid-20th century, and really tried to identify its political system in the 20th century. So that's one factor, but also, from the perspective of an American alliance, the fact that Japan became the only country to suffer from 2 atomic bombs, in a way, symbolically, it seems like was an atonement for its war crimes. I think in its symbolic identification of history. At the same time, I think this process of rebuilding itself under the same imperial identity took on a rather conservative turn in Japan. But of course, we cannot forget the incredible moment of progressive leftist women's movements that arose in the 60s and 70s. But gradually, I think the nation building process in Japan, in order to I guess maintain and develop and overcome its past, I think it chose a very conservative turn, and I think this may be one reason why the comfort women, the sexual slavery issue, and the war crimes issue has still not been resolved. But I think this is a really difficult issue. Why the Japanese government has maintained this kind of stance? Yes, Taeyong, please.
Yeah, if I could also add one point, I think all these historical issues are not separately existing from the political atmosphere in the two countries. These are actually very much reflecting the political atmosphere of the two governments and also political agendas of the two governments as well. And in Japan, I think, as Professor Lee pointed out, a lot of civil society activities are going on. But from the governmental side, after Prime Minister Hatoyama period, the government stopped to work on some value-based, foreign affairs approach. So more like a strengthening militarism or amendment of a peace treaty, a peace, constitution, and also strengthening the alliance of Japan with the United States and other countries in light of the emerging new power in China, for example. So all these political atmosphere and policies are some factor. In the same vein, in South Korea, the government is not really completely free from the demand from civil society organization. In other words, to solve the problem, to make some real changes, we also need to find a way to change the kind of political, the demands that are going on at the same time in both countries. And I hope eventually we will see some turn of the wheels. Different directions should start to build more cooperative Asia rather than going back to revival of Cold War type of confrontational international relations in Asia. Unfortunately, we have seen last couple of years very, very confrontational or strengthening of nationalism, and those political atmosphere change, I think, is also something that we need to be very much aware of.
Thank you, Professor Beck. There's a very relevant question here for Professor Lee. So this person asks, so the Ramseyer article focuses on women under contract. And this question is about, are the women who accepted and agreed to these contracts, are they also victims? And should they also be embraced by this movement? This is a very technical question, but it's a very acute one in a way. Professor Lee, what's your thought?
Okay, that is the framework formed by the Japan's, historical denialist. In the beginning of the issue, early in 1990s, the Japan's government also argued like that. The comfort women was not, a victim of the sexual slavery. Instead, they are, contracting prostitute. So at that time, we have no language to describe women's suffering, because in Korea, there is no specific law to control the sexual violence, and also prostitution is too. So at the time, I think some Koreans try to divide, the contracting issue from the, system, the sex slavery system. But I think after that, around the mid of 1990s, many of the Koreans and also people around the world, and including UN report, so appreciate and acknowledge that enforced compulsory system is like a slavery situation, whether or not they are forced or voluntary to go there. But if they are in a state of a slavery-like situation, it is the same. Very, very severe criminal against humanity. So, regardless how they could go there, regardless of that, they are, victims of humanity, I think. So I don't want to divide people, women victims into two categories. So it is a, denialist frame, I think. So would you add, Dudden, to the point? I'm familiar with your argument.
I completely agree with Professor Lee, and I think also when we're talking in the Ramseyer article, when he makes sort of the mistranslation and also egregious claims about a 10-year-old girl signing a contract, which is absurd.
Yes.
We're talking child sex trafficking. We are not talking about any notion. Plus, we're also, the article, which is putatively supposed to be for a game theory purpose, and cites pieces of evidence that don't exist. And then, as Jeannie Suk-Gerson's name has been raised, but I think we really need to do a shout out to Professor Gerson for getting for the record, the historical record, that there are no contracts. And the person who's caused all this ruckus in the first place fabricated an article just to prove a theory that he thought would be, quote unquote, kind of cool, which is possibly the most disgraceful and disgusting use of the word cool I've ever heard. But no, this is not something to be cited. And, let's flip that. Let's say, okay, let's say there were pieces of paper that a historian would be interested in reading, so we could figure it out. Let's talk about indenture contracts, right? Coolie labor contracts of indenture, which are rather interesting in terms of ripping them in half, and then you complete your indenture by putting them back together. That doesn't mean horrific conditions didn't happen. And we as humanists learn from the conditions to move humanity forward, not to prove a point of law and economics, which has nothing to do with forced sex slavery of minors. And so it's bewildering. And I think it circles back to Professor Beck's insistence that we just take this into the level of human rights and human rights discourse, because, and it is deeply frustrating because Japan, as a member state of the United Nations, has done abundant good in many ways around the world, in many instances, promoting, a host of things that have helped develop societies around the world. And this one, this core problem prevents the Japanese government from actualizing its full capacity on the international stage, and really makes it an outlier among powerful nations. What is it that is so disturbing about this particular history that prevents Japan from being a leading nation that would be able to articulate a position against the trafficking of, let's take the examples from Nigeria, from Boko Haram. Let's look at the Kurdish women and girls being trafficked. And that's precisely what the survivors today are trying to turn everyone's attention towards is moving to recognize how this is an ongoing problem. And the government of Japan keeps dragging us back by pretending that the history that we know happened didn't happen, and just continues to render it further isolated in Asia rather than further integrated into the global system.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Alexis. This may be our last question, and this is for Councillor Saw and Professor Beck. So, Councillor Saw, as someone who is a leader of the community, and Professor Beck as a director of a center that is that has an important public role, is it for you guys important for you guys to talk about this issue with the community? And how do you even talk about this issue, for example, with your family and your children, your friends, who are not so keen or aware, or maybe find this topic really difficult to understand? How do we begin to do this? David?
Yeah, personally though, I have two grown children, and fortunately they are old enough to find these articles and issues online, and they ask questions, and they sometimes come with questions they already know the answers to, and they just want me, the parents, to acknowledge what they're thinking. And I mean, we have to be sensitive, but also at the same time truthful. And again, I think the approach that we have to take is that it is the human issue, the humanity issue that all of us have to understand. It doesn't matter how young, how old they are. And I think we have to take the same approach with other cultural and ethnic groups as well. And like I've been kind of advocating that we have to reach out to these other groups, especially Japanese and especially Chinese, because we share the sort of commonality. Our generation, our forefathers went through that period that was very unfortunate at the time, and they still live through that experience, and it has been passed down to us as the next generation. So I think it's easier for us to talk about that because they do have that background, and it has to start here and now. And again, I think my focus is in Japanese community as well. We have third, fourth, fifth generations of Japanese Americans. They went through their own tribulations through the World War II. And so I'm hoping that there is some sense of, the community that has gone through the similar issues. And we can discuss that and come to the conclusion and resolution that we all have to work together to educate the city, the state, and the world that this type of denialism has no place anywhere and everywhere.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Professor Beck.
Yeah. In South Africa, as you know, after experiencing apartheid, they tried to build a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, emphasizing, on the one hand, truth seeking, on the other hand, achieving some justice so that they eventually establish some reconciliation in the society. However, it is not always easy for us to say that, truth on the one hand, on the other hand, real kind of a resolution of the solution, because we tend to just try to forget or try to just hide all bad things that had happened in the past, rather beautifying the past so that we can start with something new. But in this case, we should learn that from the history that the sufferings, the seriousness of the suffering cannot, be just done, nullified, and we cannot disregard them. Especially, this is not only some small kind of a number of victims; it was a kind of internationally known big issues. Therefore, I think we should come up with some effort to learn more about the truth. But that is not really aggravating situations. Rather, that truth will lead us to healing the wound that the past had given to us. And that kind of a process, transitional justice process, is the only way for us to go ahead for better future. So everybody should work very hard to continue also to understand what had happened in the past, and also to think about what better future we can achieve. And our center, I think, is trying to facilitate this type of dialogue rather than accusing, from one perspective against another. Rather, this dialogue will continue to enhance our efforts, to achieve humanity and also to build better relationships. So I'm happy at least to see this very, very objective way of speaking various aspects of the issues. Thank you very much for wonderful moderation.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I have one final quick question for Professor Lee, and this is our last question of the event. Professor Lee, so these days, how are you communicating with the South Korean public as the Korean Council, as the chair of Korean Council? What is your approach to this issue, to the public, and even the American public? What would you say to us?
Very, very important questions, but I'm afraid I can respond to you properly, because actually I'm doing work as a professor, and also very important work as a chair of the Korean Council, but actually it's not a chair itself. I think I feel like I am very burdened with unbearable work as a person, I think. So, but I very appreciate people inside Korea and outside Korea, like you guys. I recognize that lots of wonderful people around the world who try to take a historical responsibility willingly, and also try to make an effort to seek, truth, historical truth. So I try to make, international global alliances, reconstruct the kind of alliances again, and try to interconnect the academic people with the activist people and with the, people in politics. So I'm not sure I'm successful. I'm confident, but I try to my best. So please, please take a look at and care of that kind of issue. Please not to stop. Think about historical hidden truths. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can conclude our event here. A big thanks to all the speakers, and also much appreciation to the audience members who joined us. Okay, this concludes Korea Vision Dialogue. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.